The stone road hadn't been a road for a long time. He found it by accident, really. A break in the tree line above Blackwater Hollow where the ground felt too flat, too deliberate to be natural. Kneeling, he brushed aside a decade of pine needles and rotted leaves, and there it was, a paving stone, gray and cracked, fitted tight against its neighbor by hands that had cared about the fit. He followed the pattern upward through the trees, one stone at a time, the canvas straps of his backpack digging grooves into his shoulders that he'd stopped noticing weeks ago. He'd walked into Blackwater Hollow 3 days earlier with $14 and no particular plan beyond the next meal. The waitress at the diner had mentioned, almost as an aside, that there used to be something up in the hills, some rich man's folly nobody talked about anymore. She hadn't known the way. Nobody in town seemed to, but a road like this didn't lead to nothing, and he'd learned a long time ago that when you had nowhere in particular to be, you might as well follow the thing that looked like it used to matter. The forest thinned. The light changed first, a widening overhead, gray afternoon sky where there'd only been canopy, and then the trees simply stopped, like they'd been told to. He stopped too. The castle rose out of the hillside like it had grown there, stone the color of old bone, towers reaching high enough that their tops seemed to blur into the low clouds coming off the lake behind them. Ivy had swallowed whole sections of the walls, thick ropes of green-black vine climbing window frames, curling through empty casements, pulling at the mortar joint by joint, like it meant to bring the whole place down slow and patient, one season at a time. Below, past a slope of overgrown lawn, Blackwater Lake lay flat and dark, and the castle sat above it like it had been built specifically to watch the water and nothing else. He'd seen pictures of places like this in library books, castles in other countries with other kinds of ivy, and he'd never once expected to stand in front of one at the edge of a forest in upstate New York with mud on his boots and his stomach empty since morning. The iron gates stood open, not broken, not forced, just open, the way something is left when the person leaving didn't expect to need it closed again. Rust had welded the hinges into that position years ago, he guessed, judging by the orange bloom crawling up the bars. He stood there a long moment, canvas straps biting into his shoulders, listening to wind move through towers that hadn't held a fire in their hearths for longer than he'd been alive. Then he walked through the gates, because there was nowhere else worth walking to, and because something about the silence on the other side felt like it was waiting for him specifically. The gravel drive had long since surrendered to weeds, tall grass pushing up between stones laid by hands that must have taken real pride in the work. He could tell that much from the way the edges still held their line, even buried in green. He followed it to a set of stone steps wide enough to drive a wagon up, and then to a door so large it seemed built for something other than people. It stood ajar, same as the gates, swollen with old rain and years of settling. He put his shoulder against it, and it gave with a groan that echoed back at him from somewhere deep inside, like the building was answering. The entrance hall swallowed the last of the daylight whole. He stood just inside the threshold and let his eyes adjust, and slowly the room assembled itself out of shadow. A floor of checkered stone under a felt of undisturbed dust. A staircase curling up along the far wall wide enough for 3 men abreast. And above him, hanging from a chain he couldn't see the end of, a chandelier the size of a small car, its crystals gone gray and cobwebbed, strung together with the patient work of spiders who'd clearly had the run of the place for a long, long time. Somewhere above, a window let in a thin blade of the day's last light, and it fell across the floor in a way that made the whole room look underwater. His voice came out smaller than he meant it to. "Hello." Nothing answered, but the settling of old wood somewhere far off, the kind of sound a house makes when it's just adjusting to being touched again. He thought about turning around. He thought about the empty road behind him, the last diner sign he'd passed 14 miles back, the $6 folded in his coat pocket that wouldn't buy him a bed anywhere, even if there'd been a bed to buy. He thought about the rain that had been threatening all afternoon, and the way the sky out over the lake had gone the color of a bruise. There wasn't really a decision to make. He shrugged the pack off his shoulders and let it drop to the stone floor, the sound of it slapping flat and hollow through the hall, swallowed up into the dark above him, like the room was hungry for noise. He'd slept in worse. Barns, ditches, the back of a stranger's pickup once, outside Elmira. A castle with a roof and 4 walls and no landlord to argue with was, by any measure he could think to apply, an improvement. Before he let himself settle, he found a broken chair leg near the base of the stairs and wedged it under the great door, angled just right so it would groan loud if anyone tried to push through in the night. Old habits. A man alone learned to listen for footsteps before he learned much else. Then he sat down against the wall beneath the silent chandelier, pulled his coat tighter, and watched the dark thicken in the doorways leading off into the rest of the house. Hallways he hadn't walked yet, rooms he couldn't yet name, and told himself he'd start looking come morning. Morning came in gray through windows thick with grime, the light strained and colorless, but it was enough. He woke stiff against the wall, the chair leg still wedged under the door, undisturbed. Nothing had come through the dark to test it. He allowed himself that small comfort before he stood, worked the ache out of his shoulders, and went looking for the rest of the house. He'd found a pencil stub and a thin notebook in his pack, the kind meant for grocery lists, and he started sketching as he walked. A drifter learned to keep his bearings, or he ended up lost in his own life, and a place this size demanded it. The ballroom came first, off the east side of the entrance hall, its floor a checkerboard of dust-caked parquet beneath 3 arched windows, tall enough to march a man through standing on another man's shoulders. He could almost hear it, some old orchestra, the scrape of shoes, before the silence closed back over the thought. Upstairs, a corridor ran the length of the house, doors on either side like a hallway in a hotel nobody had checked into for decades. Bedrooms, most of them, furniture draped in sheets, gone the color of weak tea, shapes beneath them like sleeping animals. He lifted one corner of a sheet and found a bed frame carved with vines climbing the posts. He didn't linger. There would be time. The servant stairs he found by accident, a seam in the paneling behind a linen closet, narrow and steep, twisting down tighter than the main staircase, built for people meant to be unseen and unheard. He climbed down slow, testing each step with his weight before trusting it, and came out near the kitchen, a long, cold room with a hearth big enough to roast a hog, copper pots gone dull and green hanging from hooks like something left mid-meal and never finished. He marked it all in the notebook, rough lines, rougher guesses, but a shape starting to take hold on the page, the bones of the place laid bare the way he'd lay bare an engine, piece by piece, until he understood how it ran. It was a small room off the kitchen that decided him, barely bigger than a closet, one wall taken up by a fireplace still sound, the flue clear when he checked it with a match and a curl of smoke. No windows to speak of, which meant no drafts, no eyes from outside either. He spent the better part of the afternoon on it, sweeping years of dust and mouse leavings out the door, scrubbing the hearth with water hauled up from the lake in an old bucket he'd found rusting by the boathouse ruins, dragging in a chair with 3 good legs and propping the 4th with a wedge of shingle. By evening he had a fire going, small and careful, smoke drawing clean up the flue, and a floor he could lie on without feeling the cold climb into his bones. It wasn't a home. But it was a start, a foothold, and from where he sat he could see, clean down the hall toward the library door, standing half open, dark, waiting for him to come looking. Morning came gray through cracks in the shutters, and he woke stiff on the hearth floor, with the fire long dead and his breath showing in the air. The first order of business was fuel. The little room's fireplace had eaten through what he'd scavenged the night before, and a place this size wasn't going to warm itself on scraps of broken shingle and rotted trim. He went hunting through the castle, with an eye trained by years of finding what he needed where other men saw only ruin. The conservatory was where the hunt led him, a great glass room jutting off the west wing like something grown rather than built, its panes gone milky with grime, one whole section of roof cracked and letting in weather. Inside, the place had gone wild. Vines had crawled up through broken flower beds and climbed the iron ribs of the structure, reaching for the light coming through the shattered glass. Dead leaves lay in drifts a foot deep in the corners. A few withered trees, citrus by the look of the dropped fruit, long since rotted to leather, stood choked by growth that had once, he guessed, been trained and tended by careful hands. He found dry wood there, old plant stakes, a collapsed potting bench, the splintered remains of a trellis, enough to fill his arms twice over and carry back to the fireplace room. But something about the space stopped him before he left it. The bones of the thing were good. The iron frame hadn't rusted through where the roof still held, and the brick foundation beneath the dead beds was solid. It only wanted hands. So he gave it hands. Not all at once. He wasn't foolish enough to think one man could undo years of neglect in an afternoon, but steadily, the way he did everything. He cleared the broken glass first, sweeping shards into a pile he could haul out later, then hauled the worst of the dead vine away from the panes that still held, letting light back into a room that hadn't seen a clean beam of it in a long while. He propped a warped board under the cracked section of roof to keep the worst of the rain out until he could find proper glass, or something like it. By the second day, he'd found a rain barrel out back, half sunk in leaves, and rolled it under a downspout to catch water he wouldn't have to haul from the lake. A routine took shape without his quite meaning to build one. Fire in the morning, water hauled, wood gathered from whatever room gave it up easiest, an hour spent clearing brush and glass in the conservatory before the light failed. He ate sparingly from what little he'd carried in, supplemented by things the lake and the woods offered a man who knew how to look. And every evening, when the work was done and his hands ached in that satisfied way, he found himself standing at the library door, staring into the dark stacks, telling himself, tomorrow. Tomorrow he'd go in. Tomorrow came, as tomorrows do, and he finally crossed the threshold he'd been circling for 2 days. The library swallowed the sound of his boots the moment he stepped inside. Shelves rose in 2 tiers around a room shaped like the inside of a bell, a narrow iron balcony ringing the upper level, accessible by a spiral stair tucked into the far corner. Dust lay thick as felt on every surface, but the books themselves, when he ran a finger along their spines, felt dry and sound. Someone had built this room to last. Someone had built it to be loved. He worked his way along the lower shelves first, tilting his head to read titles gone soft with age, surveying manuals, geological reports, atlases fat as bricks. Whoever had lived here hadn't just collected books. He'd collected the world in pieces, folded it down into paper and leather so he could hold it in his hands. At the room's center stood a globe unlike any he'd seen, easily 4 feet across, mounted in a wooden cradle carved with waves and compass roses. The wood had darkened with age, but the brass fittings at its poles still caught what light came through the cleared windows. He circled it once, admiring the work, then noticed the cradle sat slightly askew from the medallion pattern inlaid in the floor beneath it, as though it had been nudged from true and never set right again. He put his shoulder to it out of simple tidiness, meaning only to square it back into place. The globe resisted, then gave with a grinding shudder that ran up through his palms and into his teeth. Something deep in the floor or wall responded. A low mechanical groan, metal dragging against metal, decades of disuse complaining all at once. He stumbled back, half expecting the whole fixture to topple. Instead, a full section of the bookshelf wall behind it swung inward on a hidden pivot, silent after that first groan, opening like a door that had been waiting its whole existence to be asked properly. He stood frozen, breath caught somewhere behind his ribs. Beyond the gap lay darkness, cool and mineral-smelling, entirely unlike the papery hush of the library. He fetched a lantern from the fireplace room, hands not quite steady as he struck the match, and carried the small flame back through the shelves like a man approaching something sleeping. The opening was narrow, built for one person at a time, the false shelf itself thick enough to have hidden its purpose completely. Rows of false book spines glued along a solid backing, indistinguishable from the real thing unless you knew to look. Whoever built this had wanted it found only by someone patient enough, or foolish enough, to shove a 400-pound globe half an inch to the left. He stepped through. The lantern light spilled into a circular room beyond, and what it revealed made him stop breathing entirely for a moment. Shapes rising from the floor itself, small and precise and strange, catching the light in 100 tiny glints of brass. The room was perfectly circular, walled in dark paneled wood that curved without seam, and the floor was not a floor at all, but a landscape. Raised ridges of plaster and wood standing in for mountains, a hammered sheet of tin, bent and rippled, to catch the lantern light like moving water where the lake should be. He crouched at its edge, forgetting for a moment to be afraid of the dark pressing in behind him. Every contour matched the country he'd walked to get here, shrunk down to something a man could span with both arms, and scattered across it were the brass markers, no bigger than a thumbnail, each one stamped with careful engraving too small to read without bringing the lantern close. He worked his way around the rim of it, following the shoreline in miniature, and found the town laid out near the lake's northern curve, a scatter of little brass roofs where Blackwater Hollow ought to be, the church steeple no taller than a fingernail. Roads ran between the markers in thin grooves of tarnished metal, some ending at buildings he recognized from his walk-in, others running off toward things that weren't there anymore. A marker near the western ridge read Mill, though no mill stood on that hillside now, not even a foundation he'd have noticed. Another, tucked into a fold of hills he hadn't explored, was labeled simply Lookout. His eyes kept drifting back toward the center. There, rising slightly above the surrounding terrain in a way that made his stomach tighten, sat a small carved shape unmistakably meant to be the castle itself. Towers and all, no bigger than a matchbox, every detail rendered with the same obsessive patience as everything else in this place. And directly beneath it, half hidden in the shadow, the little tower cast, was a single brass marker set into the floor at a slight angle, as if placed last, as if placed differently from all the others. He lowered the lantern until the flame nearly touched the model, careful not to scorch it, and read the tiny stamped letters ringing that last marker. They weren't a name of any road or ruin he recognized. They were something closer to an instruction, though the words themselves gave nothing away on their own. Just a short string of letters that meant nothing without more context, more patience, more searching. He sat back on his heels in the cool, dark lantern light, trembling across 100 years of somebody's obsessive mapping, and understood with a kind of dizzy certainty that whoever built this room had not been drawing the land as it was. They had been recording the land as they'd made it, every hidden structure, every vanished path, every secret folded into these hills catalogued here in miniature, waiting for someone to notice that one marker sat exactly where he was kneeling. Something was beneath the castle. Something the mapmaker had wanted remembered, even after everyone else forgot. He copied the letters onto the back of his hand with a stub of pencil before the meaning could slip away from him, then sat there a long while longer, turning the lantern slowly so the shadows swept across the model like weather moving over real hills. The marker beneath the castle sat closer to the foundation's edge than the center, tucked near where he guessed the kitchen wing stood, maybe even near the little fireplace room he'd already claimed as his own. He pressed a finger to the tiny brass shape and felt, absurdly, like he was touching something alive. The journals were the obvious next step, if he could find them. He'd noticed the cabinet days earlier without really seeing it, a squat piece of furniture wedged between two library shelves, its wood darker than the rest, its brass lock green with age. He'd assumed it held ledgers, deeds, the boring bones of a dead man's business. Now, he wasn't so sure. He went back up through the globe's hinged doorway, easing the great sphere shut behind him with the same care he'd used opening it, and crossed the library floor to the cabinet. The lock resisted his pocket knife for the better part of an hour, and he was sweating by the time the mechanism finally gave with a small, defeated click. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle at the folds, were a dozen leather-bound journals, their spines cracked, their pages foxed brown at the edges. He carried them to the reading table nearest the window, where what daylight came through the grimy panes fell in a long, pale rectangle, and opened the topmost volume. The handwriting was cramped, slanted hard to the right, full of abbreviations that made whole paragraphs read like code. But certain phrases repeated enough that he began to recognize them even before he understood them. Hollow wall, the stair beneath, keep it dark, keep it dry. Sketches filled the margins, a wall in cross-section, a lever drawn with exaggerated care, an arrow pointing down into blank white space where the page simply ended, as if the mapmaker himself hadn't dared write more. Finn turned pages until his eyes ached, piecing together fragments that never quite connected into a full sentence of instruction, only a mood, secrecy, pride, maybe fear. Somewhere in these 100-year-old pages was a location, a mechanism, a way through the wall the journals kept circling without ever naming outright. He thought of the marker glowing dull under lantern light, positioned exactly where he now sat working, and understood that the mapmaker hadn't just built a castle. He'd built a puzzle meant to outlast him, meant for someone patient enough, someone with nothing better to do than sit in a dying library and read every word twice. He lit another lantern as the light through the windows began to fail, and kept reading. The passage that finally made sense wasn't a sentence at all. It was a diagram, 3 pages from the end, showing the fireplace in the map room flanked by paneling, one section marked with a small crosshatch, and the word "Here?" written so small it looked like an afterthought. He almost missed it. He'd flipped past it twice already, his eyes too tired to catch the difference between one carved panel and the next. But the third time, Something in the sketch's proportions matched what he remembered of the wall beside the map room's own fireplace, the one he'd walked past a dozen times without a second glance, assuming it was just cold stone and old wood like everything else. He took the lantern and went to look. The panel was chest-high, framed in the same dark oak as the rest of the room, carved with a shallow pattern of overlapping circles that might have been meant to represent waves, or maybe just decoration for its own sake. He ran his fingers along the edge the way he had with the globe, searching for give, for a seam that didn't belong. Nothing. He pressed at the corners. Nothing. He was about to step back, to reconsider, when his thumb caught on a knot in the wood that felt too smooth, too round, unlike any knot he'd ever felt in real timber. He pushed it. It sank half an inch with a small mechanical sigh, and the whole panel shifted inward on a hidden pivot, swinging aside to reveal not a passage, but a narrow recess, with a lever mounted at waist height. Black iron, cold under his palm, its handle worn smooth by a hand that hadn't touched it in decades. He gripped it and pulled. Somewhere below the floor, something released. A section of the room's paneled wall, a few feet from the fireplace, groaned and shifted, dust sifting from the seam as it swung open just enough to show a gap of pure black. He held the lantern up. Stone steps, narrow and steep, descended into a dark that swallowed the light after only 6 or 7 treads. Cold air rolled out to meet him, damp and mineral, smelling of wet rock and something faintly metallic, like rain on old iron. It was the kind of cold that didn't belong to any room he'd been in yet, a cold that came from beneath the world rather than around it. He thought of the marker on the map room floor, sunk directly under where he now stood, and felt the hair rise on his arms. He set one boot on the first step. The stone was slick, worn smooth in the center, by feet long gone still. He listened for a moment. Water somewhere below, a slow drip, rhythmic and patient, as if counting the years since anyone had come this way. Then he lowered his lantern ahead of him and started down, the door creaking faintly at his back, the dark swallowing the light one step at a time. The steps kept coming, more than he'd counted for, each one worn a little smoother than the last, until the walls on either side stopped being walls at all and opened into something vast. The lantern light, so confident in the stairwell, suddenly felt small and thin, swallowed by a darkness that had size to it, weight, a ceiling somewhere far overhead he couldn't see. He stopped on the last step and just listened. The drip he'd heard from above had multiplied into a dozen soft echoes, water finding water, and beneath it all a deeper sound, a slow slap and pull, patient and rhythmic. Not a leak, a tide. He lifted the lantern higher, and the room revealed itself in pieces, the way all of this place had revealed itself to him, room by careful room. A stone floor, dry near his feet and glistening wet farther out. Pillars, thick as trees, holding up a ceiling lost in shadow. And then the light caught water, not a puddle, not a cistern, but a long black channel of it, still and dark as the lake it clearly came from, stretching away toward a low stone arch, where the air moved cooler and smelled unmistakably of the lake itself, of algae and wet reeds and open water somewhere beyond the rock. An underground harbor. He said it out loud, just to hear it, just to believe it. Along the near edge of the water sat a wooden dock, gray with age but sound beneath his boot when he tested it, the boards barely creaking. And tied to an iron ring, rocking so gently it seemed almost alive, was a boat, a launch, low and sleek, its varnish dulled by dust, but its hull whole, unrotted, cared for once with the same obsessive precision as everything else in this place. He ran his hand along the rail, and it came away only dusty, not damp, not rotten. Someone had built this to last, and the stone chamber, sealed from weather and sun, had let it. Beyond the dock, shelves lined the wall, tools hung in careful rows, coils of rope, brass lanterns identical to the ones in the tower and library, their glass intact. And crates, dozens of them, stacked and labeled in faded ink, he had to lean close to read. Not journals this time, maps, hand-drawn, edges soft with age, showing coves and inlets he didn't recognize from any shoreline he'd walked, hidden places scattered around the lake, like secrets waiting for someone patient enough to find them. He crouched by the nearest crate, lantern set carefully on the dry stone beside him, and lifted the lid slow, the way he'd learned to open everything in this castle now, expecting to find nothing, and finding instead another door into a world he was only beginning to understand. The maps went 11 deep before he found the bottom of the crate, and by then his knees ached from crouching, and his lantern had burned lower, but he barely noticed. Each sheet was a puzzle piece he hadn't known was missing, coves marked with symbols he didn't understand yet, depth soundings, notes in the same cramped hand from the journals upstairs. He set them aside carefully, meaning to study them properly once he had proper light and a table that wasn't 3 centuries of dust, and turned instead toward the far wall of the chamber, where the lantern glow didn't quite reach. There was a gap there. Not a door, not exactly, just a place where the stone didn't sit right, a seam too straight to be natural, running up into shadow he couldn't see the top of. He'd learned by now what a seam like that meant in this place. He wedged his fingers into the crack and pulled, and the stone gave with a grinding reluctance, swinging on some buried pivot he couldn't see, dust sifting down onto his shoulders. Behind it, a passage climbed, not stairs this time, but a rough incline cut straight through the rock, narrow enough that his shoulders brushed both sides, rising steeply into darkness above. He went up with the lantern held ahead of him, breath loud in the confined space, the air changing as he climbed, less like the cold mineral stillness of the harbor, more like something that had once known daylight. The passage ended at a low door, iron-banded, no handle he could find until his fingers caught a recessed latch, worn smooth by use. The door opened into a round room he had never seen from anywhere else in the castle. No windows visible from outside, he realized. This had to be the tower he'd noticed from the lakeshore weeks ago and dismissed as inaccessible, its shape swallowed by ivy and angle. Inside, everything was work. A long table ran along the curved wall, covered in tools finer than anything downstairs, tiny chisels, calipers, a magnifying lens on a brass stand. Rows of handmade models sat in careful lines. The castle itself, miniature and exact, its roof lifting off on a hinge to show rooms within rooms. Servants' stairs, rotating panels. A second model beside it, cruder, of the tower he now stood inside. Photographs were pinned along the wall above the table, faces he didn't recognize, the castle half-built, scaffolding against stone that still looked raw and new. And plans, dozens of them, curling at the edges, showing passages he hadn't found, doors he hadn't opened, walls that turned on hidden pivots throughout rooms he thought he already knew by heart. He stood in the lantern light a long moment, turning slowly, and understood that everything he'd discovered so far had only been the beginning of what this castle was willing to show him. He carried what he could down from the tower that night, one careful armload at a time, and set the models on the library table where the lantern light could reach them properly. After that, the days took on a shape he'd never had before in his life. A rhythm, a purpose, something to wake up for besides hunger. Every morning he climbed the map room's brass ladder and studied the great model of the region until he had it memorized, then went hunting for whatever it showed that he hadn't found yet. A servant's passage behind the pantry that led out into the ballroom's musicians' gallery. A pivot wall in the east bedroom that swung on a counterweight so smooth it startled him the first time it moved. Small mechanisms, most of them, but each one a door into a version of the castle that no living person had walked in years. He marked every discovery on the model with a pencil, then later with careful dabs of paint, once he trusted himself not to make mistakes he couldn't undo. Afternoons went to repair. He patched the roof over the west wing where a soft spot had let water in for probably a decade, replaced rotted sashes in the conservatory so the glass could stay upright through another winter, oiled hinges until doors that had groaned like dying things swung silent again. He kept careful count of what he spent from his shrinking cash on nails and glazing putty, and kept an even more careful count of what he built instead of bought. Shelves from salvaged planking, a new hearthstone fitted by hand. He grew, without quite noticing it happening, into someone who belonged to a place. The little fireplace room became genuinely comfortable, its corners swept, its shelf lined with tools he'd cleaned and organized himself. He started to forget, some nights, that none of it was legally his. That forgetting ended on a gray Tuesday morning when he heard tires on gravel, a sound the castle hadn't made in weeks, maybe years. He went to a second-floor window and looked down at the drive. A car he didn't recognize sat just inside the iron gates, dust still settling off its wheels, and 3 people were climbing out of it, with the unhurried, purposeful air of people who believed the ground under them belonged to them. One carried a folder of papers, another studied the towers with narrowed eyes, the way a person looks at something they've inherited but never seen. The third, older, simply stood staring up at the ivy-choked stone, as if trying to reconcile it with some memory or photograph. Finn's stomach dropped in a way it hadn't since the day he'd first walked up the vanished stone road with nothing but a canvas bag on his shoulder. He set down the rag in his hand, wiped the plaster dust from his palms onto his jeans, and went down to meet whoever had finally come looking for what he'd found. He met them in the entrance hall, beneath the chandelier he'd spent 3 evenings cleaning crystal by crystal, and he watched their faces change when they stepped through the door. The older one stopped mid-sentence, whatever explanation she'd prepared dying on her tongue as she looked up at the light scattering across the marble floor for the first time in decades. "Who are you?" the one with the folder finally managed, and Finn told them plainly, his name, how he'd come with nothing, how he'd found the place open and empty and had nowhere else to go. He expected anger. He'd rehearsed nothing, because he'd known nothing he said would matter once they saw him as a trespasser. But the older woman was already walking, drawn past him toward the library, and when she found the shelves dusted and the broken ladder rail repaired, when she saw the locked cabinet standing open with journals arranged in careful chronological order across the reading table, she pressed a hand to her mouth. "These were lost," she said. "My grandfather searched for these his whole life." He showed them the map room next, the brass markers gleaming where he'd polished away years of grime, and then, because there was no reason left to hide anything, the hollow wall, the stair beneath the foundations, the harbor with its lantern light glinting off still water, the launch he'd oiled and rigged until it looked ready to sail. He showed them the tower workshop, the models of buildings that didn't exist anywhere in the castle they'd inherited, and watched the last of their suspicion drain into something closer to wonder. "We didn't know any of this was here," the younger one said, turning slowly in the workshop's dusty light. "We grew up hearing stories. We never thought." They talked for a long while after that, at the kitchen table in the room with the fireplace, where Finn had built the first fire the castle had seen in years. The folder of papers stayed closed. Instead, they asked him questions: how he'd found the mechanism, how he'd known where to dig for the harbor entrance, what else might still be waiting behind these walls. By the time the light through the tall windows had gone amber, the older woman set both hands flat on the table and looked at him the way people look at something they've decided to keep. "We can't pay you much," she said. "Not yet. But this place needs someone who can find what we can't and fix what we don't know how to fix. Stay. Be its caretaker." Finn thought of every town he'd left, every place that had never quite held him. He looked around the room he'd cleaned with his own hands, the fire he'd built catching gold in the old stone, and understood, finally, what it meant to be afraid of losing something. "Yes," he said, "I'll stay."